this is the first time that my schedule kind of lined up to where I was home during the summer, and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak in my home church, and I consider it's one of like the highlights of my preaching so far, which isn't very much, but I just wanted to this message today. First, I wanted to say Zach's message this morning was just phenomenal, and I was really encouraged by him and seeing I grew up with Zach. For those of you who don't know, me and Zach grew up in the youth group together under Brother Zach, and to see how he's grown over the years and to see how the Lord's really shaped him has been an encouragement to me, and to see that there's a few of us, a core group from that youth group that's going on to do things for the Lord, and to see that some of my best friends came from that group, and to see him serving the Lord, and he's a dad now and a husband. It's awesome to see. And I thought it was so cool how God worked. There's no way we planned this out because we never talked about our messages. But my message is entitled "The Cost of the Cross," is what it's going to be called tonight. And it's something for me that is hard to preach on because of how familiar it is, and how whenever you look at the cross, it's become a symbol in the church. It's become this thing that's almost become routine, and something I pray about whenever I preach, and whenever I go into a missionary setting on a mission trip, or hopefully in the future I'll be going to the field. And something I pray every day is that the Lord would make the cross not routine for me. That every day I realize that what Jesus did, and how Christ, the high price that was paid on the cross, and Christ, driven by his love, satisfied the wrath of God for me and for you. And that's what the cross means. And there's a couple things I want to talk about tonight. But what I want to start off with is what the cost of the cross was to Christ. And then secondly, what will the cross cost you? So, will you pray with me today before we get started? Dear Lord, I thank you for this day. Jesus, I thank you for your Spirit. And Lord, I pray that it would surround me, Lord, and none of these words would be mine, but they would all come from you. And Lord, that you would hide me behind your cross as I speak about your cross today. Lord, I pray that your presence would be on every heart in this room, and that they would see you in this message, and that you would be known in this place, and Lord, that you'd be evident, and we would know we came to church tonight. Lord, I pray that we would go about doing your work till you return, and we'll be eagerly awaiting your return. It's all in your name. Amen. So if you would like to open with me this morning, tonight. We're going to be speaking from Matthew 16 is where I'm going to be, and I'm going to be in verse 24 is where I'm going to start. And the word of the Lord says, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in glory of his Father and with his angels, and then he will reward each according to their works.'" So from this passage, we see Jesus says, if anyone desires to come after me and follow me, they must first deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. So Jesus is the founder and finisher of our faith, and he's the one who has called us to take up our cross, him being the first one to take up his cross. So Jesus, what did the cross cost him? That's one thing we're going to delve into a little bit first. And the first thing that I want to pinpoint that the cross cost him was it cost him his place next to his Father. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, as it says in John 1:1. And then in Philippians, I'm going to be kind of running around the scripture today. But in Philippians, we see Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 says, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So imagine this. Even though he was God, he lowered himself to the image of a man. And the King of Kings was born in a barn. The eternal, invisible God lowered himself to become humanity. That's what Jesus did. He experienced emotions. He experienced hunger, pain, loss, hurt. Christ faced temptations. And the Creator became one with the creation. That's what Jesus did. And that's what the cross cost him. He had to sacrifice his place seated next to the Father to become one with his creation. A second thing that it cost Jesus. It cost him eventually his life. And it cost him separation from his Father. First, I want to, something that we preach about nearly every Easter is the crucifixion. And we talk about it in Jesus, his death, his burial, and resurrection. We speak on this pretty strongly during Easter time period, but I just want to go back and to say what the cross was. This is, a lot of times in our Christian circles today, the cross is something you wear around your neck. The cross is something that, it's an emblem that you carry around with you, and it's something that signifies that you're a Christian, which is in some ways a good thing. But I want to get the point across that when Jesus says to deny yourself, to take up your cross and follow me, he's saying, come and die with me. This was an object of suffering. This was an object of death. This was not an object of a glorifying thing at all. The Roman orator Cicero described the cross as this. He says, it was a most cruel and disgusting punishment. And the very mention of the cross should be removed not only from the Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, and his ears. A Roman orator named Cicero, the Romans were exempt from being tortured in this way. Paul could not be crucified because he was a Roman citizen. So, a Roman citizen was exempted from the cross being physically done to him, but Cicero says it should not even be exempted from his body that a Roman citizen should even be crucified. It should be taken away from his mind, his ears, his eyes. He shouldn't even be exposed to it. That's how bad this was. Jesus, when he died on the cross, I'm not getting too graphic, but I want to kind of explain to you, he was nailed to a tree. And he was beaten before that. Beaten nearly to the point of death, where it says that he was undistinguishable as a man. And he was hung on this tree and not bleeding to death. That's not the way Jesus died. Jesus died because he was hung on this tree and he couldn't pull himself up to get another breath. He eventually suffocated to death because he couldn't pull himself up enough. His strength and his muscles would have lost their strength over a period of time, and Jesus would have died because he suffocated on his own blood in his throat. That's the way Jesus would have died. It was a disgusting death, and I want you to understand that Jesus lowered himself, God lowered himself to become a man, and the Son of God hung on the most cruel object of torture that was ever invented in human history. And that's what Jesus did. That was his sacrifice, driven by love for you to fulfill the wrath of God that was supposed to be upon me and was supposed to be upon you. So, that's the death aspect, that Jesus sacrificed his life that's what the cross cost Jesus, his life. And the second aspect to that is separation from the Father. And the passage I'm going to draw your attention to is Luke chapter 22 here. And I'm not going to quote this word for word, but what this is the passage where it talks about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's in this garden, and he's agonizing with this is whenever he would have went to his disciples, and he's saying, why can't you just wait and pray with me for a little while? And he's in this garden, and he's sweating these huge drops of blood in agony. And a lot of people make the assumption, well, Jesus is sweating these huge drops of blood in agony because of what's about to happen. Because he's about to be crucified. He's about to be hung on a tree. But I have another theory as to why he was agonizing. Jesus, while he was on earth, always thought of things in a spiritual aspect. As Zach kind of talked about this morning, that no one really understood Jesus. The Pharisees would always say something, and Jesus would always, he would say to the effect of, well, the temple will be destroyed, and in 3 days it will be built again. And they didn't understand a word he was saying because he's speaking on a spiritual level that they couldn't comprehend. Similar to the blind man. When Jesus heals this blind man and he goes before the Pharisees and they're like, who is this guy? This guy who healed you? Is he a prophet? And the guy says, I don't know who he is. All I know is I was blind and now I see. And that's all I know. Jesus speaks to people on a spiritual level, not this physical, earthly level. And Jesus, I don't think, was thinking about the physical as he's agonizing in the garden. I want you to realize something impossible was about to happen. Have you ever thought this, that God was going to die? That is an impossibility. God is eternal. God had no beginning and no end. And in a moment, God was going to die. It's an impossibility. But you know what else is an impossibility? That sinners be saved. That sinners be saved. So one impossibility is answered by another impossibility. And Jesus becomes man. And God answers the impossible with his possible. And Jesus makes all things new, as he says. The main reason we see Jesus in agony in the garden is because he knew he was about to be separated from his Father. Do you understand the magnitude of the situation that we're dealing with? That Jesus, the Trinity itself, was about to be torn in two in a moment. In a moment. For the first time in human history, well, in the history of God, which he has no history, but for the first time ever, God was about to be separated from himself. Can you imagine the agony? That's why he could be sweating these huge drops of blood. That's why he would be begging, Lord, can this cup pass from my hand? He's going to be separated from his Father, which has never happened and will never again happen. And in a moment, the Trinity was torn in two. For, driven by his love, in order to satisfy the wrath of God, so that you might be saved. So in a moment, all this cost Jesus. So what did it cost him? In Mark 15, we see, Mark 15:34, we see Jesus cry out as he's on the cross, and he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? In a moment, because he had taken on the full weight of sin, because this separation had to be such spiritual torture for Jesus that it's made known that God had to turn his back because he couldn't look on his son because of the sin that was on him. So in that moment, the separation from his Father, the spiritual agony that Jesus went through, as I said, driven by his love in order to fulfill the wrath of God and satisfy that wrath for you and for me. So the cost of the cross for Jesus was everything. That was what it cost him. It cost him everything. And in Isaiah 53, 3-5, it says, he is despised and rejected by man, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities, and the chastisement for our peace was upon him. And by his stripes we are healed. So, all of this, the stripes, being rejected by man, God being rejected by man, coming to earth, and his creation rejects the Creator. It cost Jesus his relationships. It cost him his life. It cost him his separation from his Father. It cost him everything. So my second question, what will the cross cost you? And I'm going to pick up in Luke chapter 14 is where I'm going to go for this one. And I'm going to be Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Now a great multitude went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest, after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going to make war against another king, does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to meet who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while others is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, of you, does not forsake all that he has, cannot be my disciple. The text is pretty plain here. And it says, whenever I read it, I see if you're not willing to lay down all you have for the cross, Jesus is saying you're not worthy to be my disciple. And it's a hard saying. It's hard. But Jesus says, if you're not willing to lay it down, everything, you're not worthy. You have to count the cost. He gives two examples in this passage. He says, a man building a building. If you're building a building and you don't count your materials before you finish, you might not have enough to get the building done. And he's saying you count the cost before you even start building the building. And then again, he says if a king's going to make war with another kingdom, he first counts his own men to see if he can battle against that army. You count the cost before you go into something. And whenever Jesus was in front of a group of people, a lot of times in our mega churches today, we say, oh, come in, sit here. You'll be given everything you need if you come to Christ. You'll have prosperity. You'll have wealth. You'll have this. You'll have that. And that's not at all the way Jesus preached. Jesus preached, I see that there are a lot of you here. And I don't know if all of you are here for the right reason. And he says, I want to make sure you're counting the cost before you decide that you want to take up an object of torture and follow me. I want to make sure you know what you're getting yourself into before you decide to be my follower, to be my disciple. There's a heavy price. There's a heavy cost. And are you willing to pay it? Are you willing to lay it down? You might lose friends. You might be lonely. You may lose your popularity. You may lose relationships. Your own family might hate you. But is Jesus that beautiful to you? Is Jesus that important to you that you're willing to lay everything at his feet and say, you're worthy? You're worthy. Think ahead of time and count the cost. And then in this passage, in verse 34, he says, salt is good. And at first, whenever I read this, I was like, what does this have to do with the text? Because Jesus is talking about something completely different for a while. And then he goes into this and he says, salt is good. And he says, but if salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the land nor for the dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So Jesus says salt is good, but if salt has lost its flavor, what value does it have? So my question is, if you have salt and it isn't salty and it just has the appearance of salt, what value does that salt have? Does it have any? He says it's not fit. Jesus says it's not fit for the land. So back in that time, you'd use salt to fertilize your ground. It's not fit for that. And it's not fit for the dunghill, which, to avoid any crude terms, Jesus says it's not fit for poop. It's not fit for anything. Jesus is saying, what he's saying, the appearance of salt but is not salty is worthless. So if you are a half-committed disciple, that if you have the appearance of a disciple, but you aren't a disciple, what value do you have? That's what Jesus is saying here. Are you willing to give everything for the one who gave everything for you? And I'm going to tell a story real quick. And this came from a book I've been reading. And this time period was the 1970s, and it took place in Asia. And the story has a young girl in it who's about 16 or 17 years old, and she's the main character. And what happened was, in Asia, during the 1970s, the communist regime had taken over, and to have a Bible study was illegal. And in this church, the pastor was organizing this illegal Bible study. And all of a sudden, communist soldiers ran into the house where they were meeting. And they were harassing the Christians inside. And they grabbed the Bible from the pastor's hands and threw it on the ground. And the only way they would let you leave is if you spat on the Bible and, as they described it, a book of lies. And that was the only way you could leave. So, one by one, they brought the Christians in the house by the Bible. And a man reluctantly knelt down at the Bible and he spat on it and he prayed, Lord, forgive me for what I've done. And then a woman came after him, and she could barely get the spit out of her mouth. She was so afraid, and she just barely spat, but it was enough. And she said, Lord, forgive me. And then this young girl, who was about 16 or 17 years old, she knelt down at the Bible, and she picked it up, and she wiped the spit off with her dress. And she said, Lord, forgive them for what they've done to your word. And the communist soldier put the gun to her head, and he killed her. And there's all kinds of stories of triumph in the Bible, but when you look in Hebrews 11, you see these martyrs that went to their death. They were sawn in two. And this girl is in this community. This group of people that the Bible describes as being of whom the world is not worthy. And this girl understood that the Word of God was worth everything. It was worth everything to her. That she was willing to lay everything at the feet of Jesus. That she was willing to put it all away. So, are you willing to give everything for the one who gave everything for you? And I'm gonna close with one more story. And this is a story of a man. He was a man who was, a lot of you know this story, and he was a man who was demon-possessed. And he lived among tombs. And he was so wild, he would harass the townspeople as they walked by the cemetery, that he was so wild that they chained him to the tombs because they didn't want him to hurt them. And he lived among these tombs day and night, crying, screaming in agony over what these demons were doing to him. But then one day, a man came by, and he came from the Sea of Galilee in a boat, and his name was Jesus. And this man was like no other man. And the man came, and he threw himself at the feet of Jesus, and these demons cried out, and they said, "Son of God, what are you doing here? Please don't hurt us. Please just cast us into these pigs." Do you see the supremacy of Jesus? That the demons obey his voice, that they come running to him out of fear of what he will do. And these demons came, and Jesus said, "What is your name?" And they said, We're army, because we're many. There's many of us in this man. And there was a herd of pigs, about 2,000, off to the side. The cemetery was next to a cliff. And there was a herd of pigs on this cliff. And they said, "Cast us into those herd of pigs. Please don't destroy us." And Jesus says, he gives them permission. And these demons go into this herd of about 2,000 pigs. And they run off the side of the cliff. And the people of the town, how they respond. Did they come to Jesus and they say, "Oh my goodness, look at what you've done. You've healed this man. You've freed him from the bondage of sin. And these demons that were oppressing him, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Is that the way they responded? No. They responded with fear. And they said, "Please go. Leave. We don't want you here." And Jesus saw the man, and the man came up to him. And the man, overcome with love for this man who had freed him from the bondage that sin had put on him, he said, "Jesus, let me come with you. Let me follow you. Let me be your disciple." And Jesus said, "Oh my goodness, yes. You're going to come with me, and you're going to be a great conversation starter. You're going to be a great ministry tool for us. This is going to be awesome." Is that what Jesus said to him? No. Jesus said, "Go home." He said, "No, go home. Go into your villages and let them see what I've done for you. Let them see what God has done for you," is what he says. And then the man who is demon-possessed goes into this town, and he says what Jesus has done for him. So he understands the connection between God and Jesus. He understands that they're one and the same. And this man who is demon-possessed isn't far off from you and me before we were saved. And think about your life before you were saved. And you may not have been possessed by a demon, but you were controlled by the devil. And you were following the desires of your father, the devil, before you accepted Christ. And it may not have been as obvious as this man, but you were still controlled. And think about your encounter with Jesus. Think about the time he stepped out of the boat for you. The time that you ran to his feet. And the time he freed you from the bondage that was capturing you. And that's the cost. That's what outweighs the cost. Because you see the reward on the other side. You see the man that can free you. The man who the blind man says, "I don't know who he is. But I was blind, but now I see." I don't know who that man is. But I was blind, and now I see. And like this demon-possessed man, he says, "I know who he is. He's God. That's who he is." So if you'll pray with me. Dear Jesus, I thank you for coming out of the boat for me. I thank you for freeing me of the bondage that was weighing me down. God, for breaking the shackles that held me. Lord, I pray that your Spirit would move on who it will tonight. God, I pray that those who have ears to hear would hear your truth. Lord, the cost doesn't matter in comparison to what you can do. Lord, I pray that everyone in here would be willing to lay down everything at your feet. God, because everything else doesn't matter. Nothing matters in comparison to you. Our relationship with you is everything. And Lord, like that little girl, Lord, I pray that we'd have a love for your word that would pale in comparison to anything else. God, your truth would reign supreme in our hearts. And God, that we'd let our communities know what you freed us from. God, that they would see and they would marvel at what you've done for us. Lord, I thank you for who you are and what you continue to do. And it's all in your name. Amen. So if you would like to come and pray tonight, the altar is open. If you feel that you're holding back on something that maybe you haven't examined in a while, the cost, but you know Jesus is worth it, and you just want to let him know that you're willing to lay it all down at his feet. And if you haven't counted the cost, pray that you'd do that tonight, and that you would see that the cost pales in comparison to what Jesus can offer.